The National Interaction Model. This learning model was developed and formalized by communication theorists to analyze the diffusion of an innovation through a social system consisting of individuals. Each model relies on one of the five mechanisms to justify why governments emulate other governments when making public policy. And the first equation, L, represents the proportion of individuals in the social system who are potential adopter and serve as a ceiling on possible adoptions. If a person in the system is unconstrained and may adopt, then L equals 1. In T is the cumulative portion of adopter in the social system at the end of time period T. In T, 1 is the cumulative proportion at the end of the previous period. Delta in T is the proportion of new adopter during period T. With some algebraic manipulation, you get the second simplified equation. When the cumulative proportion of adopter is graphed against time, the equation previously discussed yield an S-shaped curve. Early in the diffusion process, adoptions occur relatively infrequently. The rate of adoption increases dramatically but begins to taper off again as the pool of potential adopters becomes small. The regional diffusion model. Neighbor models, fixed regional model. The regional diffusion model assumes that governments are influenced primarily by other governments that are geographically in the same proximity. Fixed region model assumes that some collectivity of jurisdiction, example the United States and countries in Latin America, is divided into multiple regions and that the governments within the same region tend to emulate each other's policies. The difference between the two models is a specified channel of influence. Fixed region model suppose that all governments within the same region experience the same channels of influence. Neighbor model assumes that each government has a unique set of reference jurisdictions for coups on public sector innovation. There are problems with each model. Neither is perfect and entirely realistic. Fixed region model imply that some jurisdictions, those bordering another area, are completely unaffected by some of their neighbors. The neighbor model assumes that jurisdictions are close but share no border have no influence over another. A more realistic expectation, a model that would assume that jurisdictions are influenced mostly by neighbors but also by other jurisdictions nearby. Leader-laggard model. The leader-laggard model assumes that certain jurisdictions are pioneer in adoption of a policy and that other jurisdictions emulate these leaders. The leader-laggard model is most compatible with the mechanism of diffusion of learning. Much of leader-laggard model has to do with risk and the ability for a leader to take a risk within a new jurisdiction and new policy standards. The leader-laggard model also represents imitation in that officials in one jurisdiction may be highly regarded by their peers than other jurisdictions' officials, making policymakers more likely to turn to the jurisdiction for coups. Internal determinant explanation for policy adoption. Internal determinant models presume that factors causing a government to adopt a new program or policy or political, economic, and social characteristics of that jurisdiction. It's rare that a jurisdiction adopts policies strictly on their own without outside influence. Therefore, it's believed that internal determinant model must acknowledge that when a government adopts a policy new to the world, media coverage and institutionalized channels of communication among governments make it likely that knowledge of the policy spread to other jurisdictions. One important issue in the evaluation of internal determinant model is how the dependent variable the propensity of a government to adopt a policy or a set of policies is defined. In research prior to 1990s, the dependent variable was determined by the earliness of adoption of a policy, whereas in most recent research, the dependent variable is based upon the probability of adoption of the policy. The choice of a dependent variable. One important theoretical issue in the construction of internal determinant model is how the dependent variable, the propensity of government to adopt a policy or a set of policies, is defined. In research prior to 1990s, most internal determinant models made the American state their unit of analysis and employed a dependent variable that assumed that the earlier a state adopted, the greater it is innovativeness. More recent research generally conceptualized the propensity of jurisdiction to adopt a policy differently. One important difference between the two dependent variables, the probability of adoption, is a concept that is defined for each jurisdiction and at any point and free free of change over time, whereas the earliness of adoption takes whereas the okay, free to change over time, whereas the earliness of adoption takes on a single fixed value for each jurisdiction determined by the year it adopts. Hypothesis from internal determinant model. Much of the theory underlying internal determinant models of government innovativeness at the individual level. For example, a tremendous level of support has been generated for the proposition that persons with greater socioeconomic status, higher level of education, income, and wealth are more likely to innovate than persons with less status. Factors reflecting the motivation to innovate. Numerous scholars have hypothesized that the problem severity is an important motivation to innovate. For example, poor economic conditions contribute to the adoption of Matters aid program by increasing demand and need for assistance. Obstacles to innovate and the resources available to overcome them. Theories of individual and organizational innovation have stressed the importance of financial resources, wealth and income level for an individual, and lack of resources for organization. And other characteristics, for example, a high level of education for an individual and large size for an organization, reflecting the capacity of potential adopter to innovate. Some new government programs require major expenditure, and therefore the availability of financial resources is prerequisite for adoption. Thus, one can hypothesize that the fiscal health of a government often has a positive impact on its propensity to adopt a new policy. Others have argued that while resources are prerequisite for government innovation, devoted individuals to push for adoption of the policy is critical too.